Hi everyone, this is just a short video giving some context to the sort of first module that we have together in EDU 553, focused on giving some context to this course through the lens of why behaviors can easily get misread from a teacher or professional standpoint. So I'm going to begin with a scenario, and this scenario is about Marcus. And either this scenario is something that you've experienced yourself as the teacher or professional or adult, or it's one that maybe you're a school psych or an SLP or a special educator and you heard a general education teacher talking about a student this way. Either way, this is going to ground us together in something that happens quite frequently when we think about behavior. So I'm going to paint a picture for you. It's mid-morning. You have a class full of students. You've given one of the least favorite tasks for this particular group of students, a writing assessment. And so this is a task that's based on a reading they were given. And so you're trying to determine what they understand from this big text they've been reading for several days together, and they have to write about it. So technically it's a writing assignment or assessment. And after you give the instructions, most of the students get started right away. They start working, but one student, we'll call him Marcus, hasn't started doing anything. He hasn't written a single word. He took his time getting out the paper. He took his time getting out the pencil or pen, or maybe it's a laptop or an iPad or some other sort of tablet that he's using. Either way, he hasn't gotten started. And as you're wandering the room to check how people are doing, you're noticing still not working. So he's got now slowly his materials, but he's just really sitting there, and he starts to fidget, and that fidgeting gets worse. And now that fidgeting is kicking his foot against the table, tapping things on the table, trying to draw his attention to himself. And maybe it starts to really bother the students that are working next to him, so much so that it's becoming increasingly disruptive. And the story that forms in your mind, or maybe in an educator's mind, is automatic in some cases. And you start to think in the back of your mind, why is he doing this? He doesn't want to get started on this task. Or maybe you think he's being lazy. Or maybe it's he always does this. Or why is he choosing this today of all days? Or any number of things that sound like that, which are common thoughts that we can have. We are just humans working with other humans. It's easy when we're managing a whole classroom of students to have those thoughts. But what if the story in our mind, the quick narrative that's generated about Marcus in this scenario, what if it's wrong? Because it's likely that it is, not because it's inherently wrong, but because maybe we're missing some important details about what's going on because we don't have access to the full inner world of Marcus and what's going on. But it's really important that we begin this course thinking about the stories we tell ourselves and each other about behavior. Humans are kind of meaning-making creatures by nature. When we see something, including behavior, that maybe disrupts us or we weren't expecting, it was maybe confusing, we reach for an explanation. We want to understand it and say, this is why I think this happened. And that explanation that we often reach for could be about maybe character or choices, or that it's inherent to the student or something the student is doing. So we might think or say things to ourselves like, they're unmotivated, they're defiant, they are attention-seeking, they are manipulating me. And these words, when we start having them in our mind, the issue becomes that they're not exactly neutral words. When we're saying words like attention-seeking, they tell a story about who the student is. And the danger there becomes once we believe that story, even if it's just kind of in the back of our mind, it can begin, if we're not careful, to shape everything we do next. We begin to respond to that sort of label we've given to the student and not to what the student is presenting to us anymore. And frequently, as I've said, that story can be incomplete. It's not just that it's wrong, it's that maybe we don't have the full picture, because behaviors are more than just what we see on the surface. So here's just some things to think about for this course specifically in terms of things that are frequently misread when we think about behaviors in the classroom. And I say that there are probably several things, but the three we see from the research consistently getting misread as maybe an attitude problem or attention seeking or a choice issue, they're going to show up in this course repeatedly, and they're important to kind of layer into those other FBA, ABA analyses type things that we've been learning about to deepen our understanding that there could be additional layers in addition to those things that we're also learning about antecedents, about functions of behaviors. We can layer in some things here that are often part of behaviors that can easily be misread to look like something else. The first one is dysregulation. That's when we're seeing a student's nervous system becoming super overwhelmed. And we may not know why, we may never know why it's happening, but the idea that something like stress, something that happened to that student maybe before they walked in, maybe a sensory input, maybe the transition itself, maybe they're having thoughts or feelings, emotions, sensations in their mind that they're dealing with, that they can't access what's going on, or maybe they're not having an easy time accessing the reasoning parts of their brain the way we expect them to when we expect them to. But what it looks like to us from the outside could be defiance. It could be aggression. It could be shutting down. It could be falling apart and giving up completely. But what it actually could be is a nervous system that's in survival mode. They're doing the only thing that they know how to do in that moment, which is preserve their energy or address the thing that maybe caused them to be dysregulated to begin with. And here's the important part, that behavior is ultimately serving a purpose. It might look on the surface irrational to us. It could look dramatic. It could look manipulative, but it is almost always an attempt to regulate, even if it's not a very good, air quotes, quote unquote, good attempt to regulate. It's something that they've developed in order to cope with whatever they're experiencing, to manage something that maybe feels unmanageable to them. The behavior makes sense when you understand it only in the way of what it might be trying to do or accomplish for that student. But because what's happening before or underneath is largely unseen by us, we just see what it looks like, even though it could be dysregulation. The second one is executive function. And executive function is a set of cognitive skills that lets us do a lot of important things kind of under the surface, or almost, because it's executive functions, over the top, almost like management, like start tasks, hold information in our mind, shift between activities, manage our feelings, sensations, and frustrations, and organize our behavior towards a predetermined, personally set goal or something we're trying to accomplish. And these skills are developmental, so they're not fully available to students until they're growing into adulthood. And for many students, they are actually developing while they're in school with us. And it's a known thing that for some students, executive functions develop more slowly or inconsistently than for other students. So we know it's an area we need to support for lots of students. So this is where I want to introduce the frame that I think could be useful when we're thinking about this course, which is maybe something we're seeing in a behavior for a student is a can't versus a won't. And you'll hear me say this repeatedly, and a long history of being a behavior teacher working with some pretty extreme behaviors is trying to understand very quickly sometimes when what we're seeing is a can't behavior or a won't. Can't is usually something that the student doesn't have the skill. That means they genuinely can't do what we're asking of them, not because they're making a conscious choice to not do it, although that could be part of it, but because the skill isn't there yet, or it's not there yet consistently. And so the response to can't should be to teach the skill. So that can drive what we're providing to the student, because when we realize something we're seeing is a can't, we know we need to teach to that skill. A won't is different. A won't means the student maybe has the skill, and we have evidence. We're not making that assumption like we're using with the Marcus scenario. We're not making an assumption they have it. We have evidence to suggest they actually have the skill, but something is in the way of them engaging in whatever that is. So in this case, it could be fear, it could be anxiety, it could be a history of failure, it could be a relationship that they're having trouble with, the teacher they've maybe had some issues with before, or a parent relationship, so a relationship is breaking down, an environment suddenly doesn't feel safe to them. And it's important to note that a won't isn't always about laziness, but it's usually about what we control as an educator, like a barrier. And so the response to a won't is typically to find whatever that barrier is, do a neutral analysis of if it's something we can remove as a barrier, and then begin to address it. Mark is sitting there not writing in our scenario. Maybe it's a can't. Initiating an open-ended task like writing, which is already a cognitively demanding task, is genuinely hard for his brain. So that is possible in this scenario. Might be a won't for him because he tried last time, it went badly, and thought, not going to do that again. But either way, the answer isn't a consequence in this case. It might actually be a question for the teacher to question more in depth to understand what's going on. And the third one here that's often most misread is motivation. And we will talk just a minute more about this, elaborating, because I think it's important to think about this. Motivation isn't a fixed trait. It's actually a response to conditions that are given. So it's environmental. It's a student who looks unmotivated in one setting could actually be super motivated, super engaged in another. And we hear that all the time. You'll have a student that'll be in a language arts class and they will look completely unmotivated. And they can show up in gym and they will be so motivated they look like a different student. And that gap tells you something important about the conditions, not about the student. So the question is rarely, why won't this student try? Or what's wrong with this student? The question when we think about motivation is, what conditions might be missing that would make trying feel possible, or make that behavior we want them to engage in a possibility for this student? And I know this is getting a little longer in length, but I do want to make one more note about motivation. I think this is important because motivation is a very misunderstood concept, especially in education. I think it's one of the more misunderstood concepts, and I think that's why it's important for us to consider this, because we live in a culture in general that really values and loves motivation. We love motivational speakers. We like to feel and be motivated by others. Motivational videos, it could be inspirational quotes, and that's all wonderful. It is not to say we should not be doing those things, because they're great. We've all felt motivated or fired up and have feelings after we heard a powerful story or maybe a motivational speaker. And we really value coaches that are out there motivating team members, and we want coaches to come and motivate us as teachers or professionals. But here's the thing. Feeling motivated and being able to act on motivation are not the same thing at all. You can feel, and this has probably happened to all of us, completely inspired and super motivated and still not know how or where to begin. You can want to do something and genuinely want to do it and still be sitting there thinking, I'm not really sure where to begin. Because motivation, that feeling, doesn't automatically give you the skills to initiate, to organize, to follow through. And really, that's often the gap that we're seeing. Not attitude for students, not caring, not disinterest, but the actual cognitive machinery for getting something started, for actually having the skills to consistently rely on them in order to engage in a bunch of tasks is often the missing piece for our students. So when we think about Marcus sitting there, not writing from our scenario at the beginning of this, and we're thinking he's unmotivated, we're probably describing what it looks like, but we're not describing what is actually and truly happening to or within Marcus. And that's important. So in this course, to give that context here, why this matters and why we're starting with this why is because this is a thread that's going to run through the whole course. We're going to be thinking about how behavior serves a purpose, and we're adding, as I said, some maybe color to the lens that we've been using through FBA and ABA analyses of certain components of behavior. And it might not always be obvious to us, and it might not always be obvious to the student, but what we have to do is spend time understanding the purpose of a behavior. It is always doing something. It is meeting a need for the student. It might be avoiding something painful, communicating something that couldn't be said in any other way. And when we try to understand that purpose, you can do something with it. You can plan for it. And that's really what a behavior support plan is. It's not a consequence system to stop students from doing something. It's actually a plan built on a deeper understanding of who that student is, with an attempt to really understand the purpose that behavior serves that student. So as you start thinking about that lens in this course, that's what we're going to be working with this semester, is to start practicing thinking through and really working with the question, what is this behavior telling me? And what is that behavior doing for that student?